Welcome everyone to Reading Comp Lesson number 5. This is actually a continuation of a sort of meta series that I've been doing, which covers flexibility and how to attain it on the various different sections. And today's section is going to be RC. Specifically, we'll be doing PT55 Section 2. I believe this is the third passage. It is the Maxine Hong Kingston talk story one, which has something of a reputation for being difficult, and we'll see how we can get rid of that. So as I was saying, this is actually another in a sort of meta series that I'm doing that's not really limited to just one section of the exam, but is a common theme. Flexibility is probably the single most important thing that I do try to get across. I haven't really been explicit about it thus far, but I have found that a number of students are benefiting from being explicitly told how to do flexibility, so I'm sharing that here. So if you've really been paying any sort of attention at all, you'll have noticed that fundamentally my basic RC approach, which is founded on reading for structure almost obsessively, does have flexibility hard-coded into it. The way I read things and the way I do questions does not really depend on the content whatsoever. So it could be about anything, I could still have a similar logical response. Doesn't really matter. And however, or maybe because of that fact, I haven't really emphasized flexibility per se. Most of the curriculum thus far is more explicitly about accuracy or speed. And so, as was the case with LG, the key to staying flexible in RC is to adopt a set of widely applicable principles that you can always use, not rigidly adhering to a highly specific set of techniques that are more hit or miss than these vaguer principles. So as the title slide said, we will be working with Prep Test 55, Section 2, questions 14 through 21. This, I believe, is the third passage of the section. And this is the talk story one about Maxine Hong Kingston, a Chinese-American writer. It's unfortunately going to take quite a bit of text to do, but I will present all on one slide here my set of RC principles that I run every passage by. And so I just do want to make a note about principles. I didn't really talk about this when I mentioned my LG principles, but there is a trade-off between what I would call technique and what I would call a principle. Technique is very specific. You know exactly when and how to use it. It's just that the situations in which it is usable is a bit limited and can be easily manipulated by the test writer to not really fit. Principles, on the other hand, while they are vaguer and they offer less specific guidance for a fewer number of specific situations, they always allow you to at least have a positive forward-moving response in any situation, which is why I consider them generally superior. So it's not so much that they are more powerful and that they will get you an answer, guaranteed, like certain techniques will. But at the same time, there are fewer situations in which it will not help you in some way. And that's what I find a lot of you are really running into on RC, is that it's not so much that a single question or answer choice or even a passage is really too hard for you to understand. Given enough elbow grease and time, most of you can reach a certain satisfactory level of understanding. It's just that before you kind of get to that point of workability, you guys get stopped cold. That's really the problem. You guys get scared, stop cold, and just stop working. The principles will allow you to not have to stop and just keep pushing forward. So starting with principle number 1, reading for structure. Again, this is something that I recommend that you always do. It may take slightly different forms, but it is something that I recommend that everybody does in every single passage. So again, to briefly review, what I consider content reading, which is the wrong way to read a passage, that focuses on what the author says. What I'm recommending people do, which is structural reading, that is reading for why or for what logical purpose the author says stuff and where they say it. That's what I mean by structural versus content reading. What I want to super emphasize here is that you can understand structure even if you don't get the content. To put it more simply, you can understand why something has been said, even if you don't understand what exactly that something is. And that is extremely powerful and extremely important, and not nearly enough of you understand and accept this. So I'm going to keep saying it until enough of you do one day. But that's the truth. That's what helps you get past hard content with some meaningful information at the same time, rather than just skipping it and hoping for the best. My second RC principle is to avoid rereading during the initial read-through. This is usually a complete waste of time. There are, of course, exceptions. Let's say that you just got a little panicked or flustered and your eyes literally passed too quickly over the words and you didn't actually read some of them. Then yes, rereading it and actually reading the words that you failed to read, that would make a difference. But for the most part, where the most valuable minutes are lost and the most valuable energy is wasted is when you are rereading things not because you missed the physical words, but because you feel like you need to understand content. And most of the time, actually, the sad reality is that those of you who are doing this, you're not actually increasing your understanding by reading it 2 or 3 times. You're just thinking you do after a while, but you don't actually get what you're supposed to get out of it anyway. So if that's going to happen, why do it? So while principles 1 and 2 are more a general reading thing that I won't really have much opportunity to call out directly, principle 3 is where we get into a little bit more nitty-gritty stuff. And this is how to deal with things when content level details do stand out. So even though we're focused on structure while we're reading, we do eventually have to address content on some level when it comes to answer choices. And so when we go back and deal with content level details, there's actually more than one kind, I would say, of content to look at. So the first thing to distinguish between is what I would consider a mere vocabulary or definitional content. These are words, terms, or phrases that are really a stylistic, non-technical word, as in it doesn't seem to be related to the subject matter of the passage, but it's more just like a fancy way of saying something. Don't let these scare you. They will always be defined very quickly by context. Search immediately in that word or term's vicinity for that context, and you should be able to find it. And so rather than boring you with more explanations and exhortations about it, I will simply be able to demonstrate it, I believe, on one of the very first paragraphs of, if not the very first sentence of the passage. So don't worry if this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you. I will show you what it means briefly. Principle 3.2. So this is the second kind of detailed content level thing that you can sort of distinguish between, and that's a technical understanding. So previously in 3.1 we were talking about things that were mere vocabulary or definitional, and I told you that those were not technical. So what actually is technical in my mind? I would consider technical concepts those that aren't just, hey, I don't know what this fancy looking word means, but they are instead things that have to do with the actual subject matter of the passage itself. So if this was an art passage, technical understanding, technical information would be about a property of that artistic work. And if this was a science passage, maybe it would be the significance of a scientific experiment or how it was run, something like that. Basically things that have to do not so much with just mere language and communication, but more about the actual subject matter that is inside the passage itself. And so while I'll have a couple of chances to show you how I deal with it, this mostly, I want to leave this principle out here, 3.2, mostly for you to think about as you're practicing. I suggest getting into the habit of thinking how to explain this to somebody you want to impress, but that someone also doesn't have any knowledge of either the subject matter or the exam itself. So this should get you into a place where you're simplifying, but also not oversimplifying. And that habit is going to be handy for dealing with this kind of information. So as I said, this is really something that's meant to be built up during practice as a habit, but really even if it doesn't fully click, even if you don't really find the best compromise in your mind between simplification and oversimplification, the habit of at least trying to simplify the complexity is helpful on the real deal, not just on practice. You do have to, I think, inculcate a mental habit of being able to translate things into something that's at least more useful to you, even if it's not more useful to some unknown stranger as an explanation. But it has to be at least more useful to you. Just dealing with the words on the page exactly as they are is asking for trouble and as asking for traps to be laid for you that you don't really know how to deal with. On some level, you do have to learn how to translate some of this stuff just to be able to deal with the sheer pipeline of data that you're going to have to handle to get all this done in 35 minutes. Principle 4 is another reading-related one. So far, all of these have really been mostly about reading, but it also bridges into a little bit how you handle answer choice language and question language as well. And because of that, I would consider this perhaps a little bit more important than most of the stuff that we've seen on this slide so far. And I want to, just without any further ado, I'll just say it. Whenever possible, recognize academic writing / RC habits and think predictively. When it comes to RC, I encourage you to think of it this way. Think of someone you know, where you just know where they're about to go in certain conversations. So as soon as a certain political subject or something else uncomfortable is brought up, you know exactly what they're going to say. They've got their pet thing that they always say, and it always makes everybody feel terrible. So in your head, you're thinking, oh man, this shit again. Of course it is. You are predicting and knowing where they go because you've seen it before. And RC is very much that person. Guys, you've seen it all before. If you haven't yet, you will if you've done any amount of decent practice. It's the same nonsense, even outside of just the LSAT. This is also academic writing in the English language. It conforms to a fairly predictable set of rules. Some of those rules include, if you use the word also, that implies that there was something in the same category that came up ahead of it in the list. So just stuff like this. You can recognize a lot of patterns that just are part of academic writing. Don't lose sight of those. And finally, of another very important one, principle number 5, be critical of answers on a logical basis, not a factual one. This is something that I also personally struggle with on the most difficult questions, so let's get into it a little bit. The only advice I really have for this principle is to be sensitive to opposition / contrast or agreement / similarity. Do the claims or implications in the answer choice fit anywhere in the overall structure as you understand it of the passage? These are more important than individual facts most of the time, but I will admit fully that it is very easy to get lost in facts and not really give logic a fair shake. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, I did this precise thing on one of the questions, so it'll be a demonstration of how to properly engage Principle 5. And so I'm actually just going to dive into the passage itself, starting with paragraph 1. And as I do, I'm just going to read the first and the last sentence and then just guess everything else. So the first sentence, critics believe that Maxine Hong Kingston, who I will abbreviate henceforth as MHK, produced her works ex nihilo. Oh, interesting. So I actually have a chance to invoke Principle 3.1 immediately here. Immediately after the term ex nihilo is dropped in the passage here, we do get the next phrase saying that they lack a large traceable body of direct literary antecedents. So we can take from this that apparently something that doesn't have a direct or traceable ancestor, a clear origin story, if you will, can be described as ex nihilo. Maybe the term out of nowhere is a decent substitute. You can substitute however you want, but I think that's the most clear thing that we can get from context. And given the length and inefficiency of the context explanation of what could have been said with just the two terms ex nihilo, that's exactly why we use fancy words and Latin terms, especially within the legal profession. It's more efficient in a lot of ways, and so while I wouldn't recommend going out of your way to get more literate just for the purposes of the LSAT, you should, I would say, between now and starting law school, just get comfortable with the idea that a lot of terms of art and terminology are going to be introduced like this. It just makes more sense to have a common set of terms for the profession than have to write paragraphs explaining what simple concepts are when you can just substitute a name for it. Just plain old logic. And so the last sentence, which also happens to be the only other sentence in the paragraph, these critics have looked at written texts and have overlooked MHK's works linking back to a Chinese oral tradition called talk story. Alright, so starting on my analysis of this paragraph. So as always, the first thing I consider is any material that I may have skipped. There was no such material here. We had a 2-sentence paragraph, read the whole thing. Now, more interestingly, I do, because this is the leading paragraph, I do have quite a bit of space to predict where I think this is going. Based on Principle 4 being a little bit predictive whenever possible, and kind of using pattern recognition to guide my way, I'd bet my house that the rest of the passage is going to be about 1, what talk story is, and 2, how Maxine Hong Kingston's work relates back to talk story. Another prediction that Principle 4 would encourage me and nudge me to make is that there was a very clearly a Western versus indigenous element to it, and a written versus oral bent to all of this. Both of these things are old and durable obsessions for RC. They've been part of this exam for decades. If you've done any amount of reading comp and you still haven't recognized them, that's on you. I'm telling you now, that's a pattern. Recognize these patterns. And so, generally speaking, how these patterns play out is that the Western scholarship, the Western establishment, is incapable of fully understanding and appreciating something unique about the indigenous way of doing things, basically non-white, non-Western. And very similarly, it's kind of a parallel setup with written cultures versus oral cultures. People who are trained in a written culture do not understand how oral cultures can have many of the same sort of structures and formalities and value. And that's something that our LSAC authors very often call people out on in our RC passages. Moving on to paragraph 2, the first sentence. We hear in this part that talk story is kind of performed and done within an ethnic family setting, and it rarely makes it into writing. Simple enough. The last sentence talks about a transplanted oral heritage, whatever that was, simply embraced new forms when it came to the U.S. I would guess that that's probably that heritage that they're referring to. Could very well be talk story, but I'm open to the possibility that actually talk story was part of some larger heritage based on what I may or may not have skipped. And now moving into analysis. Stuff I skipped, and there was a bit of it here. If I had to guess, it's probably some details on talk story, because this paragraph does seem to be about what talk story actually is. So accordingly, kind of based on my structural reading and some of the technical knowledge, which are Principles 1 and Principle 3.2, this paragraph is the first place I'll look if we are asked about talk story itself, not really MHK or any of her work or anything else like that, but what is talk story if we were asked questions about that, this is where I would look. Now, in terms of where the passage is going from here, I'll be leaning on principle 4 as I usually do. And as we just saw, my prediction from last time, at least part of it, about discussing talk story itself, that came true. So, I'm just going to guess here that my other prediction about how and why we should agree that MHK's work comes from talk story, that's about to hit us. Paragraph 3 now, the first sentence, MHK herself believes that she is a talk story artist of some kind. And now our last sentence. For MHK, the term writer is equivalent to performer. So MHK apparently doesn't write story that's locked. I think the word that they use here, yeah, it's frozen. See, they don't write a story that's locked/frozen into set words, but apparently the story lives and grows around those frozen words. So it's not really caged up by the fact that these words are written and that they're just kind of recorded as they are. Supposedly, talk story and what MHK does gets around that. And now into the usual analysis. Stuff I skipped, and there is quite a substantial amount of stuff that I did. We're probably going to hear some real artsy stuff about MHK's process, right? Likely not much about her actual work itself, but more about how she creates stuff or how she sees herself as a creator. More about, again, her process of making stuff rather than what that stuff actually is. And I base this prediction on pretty much the first sentence and the last sentence, just those two things. We clearly lead off this paragraph by having the author give MHK a space to voice her own opinion of her own work in her own style. And then by the time we get to the end, we hear that she's doing X, Y, and Z things. So this would be a good place to look for that, I think. So accordingly, again by Principle 1, a structural reading, and 3.2, which is technical knowledge of a passage, this paragraph is the first place I'll look if we are asked about how MHK sees or describes her own work. And now to do our usual Principle 4 prediction magic with where the passage is going. So this paragraph discussed how MHK's own beliefs put her into the talk story camp. I had bet my house again, since I still haven't lost this passage, that the next and final paragraph will discuss MHK's actual work and the properties of that work that make it identifiably part of the talk story tradition. And so so my prediction was that we would talk eventually about not only what talk story is, but how exactly MHK is part of the talk story tradition. And they've kind of split it up here. Paragraph 3 is clearly about how MHK herself is consciously attempting to become, or portray herself as part of the talk story tradition. And if I had to guess, again, I would say that the rest of this, MHK is in fact part of the talk story discussion, is going to come from not an investigation of her own opinions of her work, but an investigation of her actual works themselves. So basically they split the, MHK is part of talk story element of the discussion into two parts. The first is that MHK believes herself to be a talk story, or however to express that. And not only are her beliefs there, but her works also prove that she is a talk story-er. Moving on to our fourth and final paragraph. Paragraph 4, our first sentence, MHK's book Chinaman demonstrates that she is in fact a talk story artist. It is good to be right. But yes, this is exactly lining up with the predictions that I've had so far. The last sentence is that in Chinaman, MHK also succeeds in doing all this sort of artsy stuff that honestly in my first initial reading, I just skipped it due to Principle 1. I really cared more about the structure than what the details themselves were, so I just know that we're going to find a lot of complementary things that the author attributes to MHK here at this part. But really the important part was that all those nice things, all those complementary things that the author attributes to MHK, the significance of that is that all that stuff makes MHK's work a written form of talk story. So this basically is just another fancy repeat of what we got in the first sentence, which is that MHK's work also shows that she's a talk story person. It's not just that she wanted to and thought of herself as a talk story person. Her works also actually fit the profile of what a talk story person would make. We will now be moving into the analysis phase. And of course, starting with the stuff that I skipped. The first thing I'm going to guess is that there's probably at least a couple of different ways that Chinaman / the rest of MHK's work is identifiably talk story. And this is based on Principle 1 and maybe even Principle... Principle 1 really is the only place it really comes from. It's really based solely on the word also in the last sentence, which indicates that paragraph 4 contains at least one other example of what Chinaman is up to. So we hear that Chinaman does all this, complementary stuff that I also didn't read specifically, but we know where it is. It's at the closing of the last sentence. But the fact that also is in the word of the last sentence means that if whatever's in the last sentence isn't also, that means there must be something of the similar series ahead of it. And that's clearly something that I skipped. So when it comes to structural reading and technical knowledge and mapping it into one place, I'm going to say if we're asked about what makes MHK's work talk story, or what makes any written work maybe part of talk story, I'm going to look here first. So another sort of mapping / structural reading thing that we're going to do here is that if we are asked ever about unique or special features of MHK's work, I'm also going to look here because specifically the last sentence, it seemed packed with like complimentary things that our author had to say about what MHK was up to in Chinaman. So this might be a good place, a good source for that information. And of course, just because we always do this, in terms of where the passage is going, things to predict according to passage 4, we of course know that in terms of where the passage is going to go from here, it's going to go nowhere. We're done. Paragraph 4 is the end. This stage of the reading is where I generally do some predictions on author attitude kinds of things. It seems like our author overall expresses admiration, I guess, of MHK and Talk Story, but I can't really tell what else is going on other than the fact that they don't think what MHK was doing in Talk Story was at least a bad or stupid thing. They think it's a valuable thing that most people did not give enough value to previously. So that's really the only other thing that I can add to what I see here. And now let's hit an overall review of the passage going paragraph by paragraph. Starting with paragraph 1. This kind of talks about here the critics mistakenly think MHK's work is ex nihilo, but it's actually part of the talk story tradition. So it introduces the West versus indigenous, written versus oral sort of divide here. Paragraph 2 is about what talk story is, and I'm just going to kind of stop. We know that those details are there if I care to find them in terms of things that talk story actually is. Its history, what exactly is it? This is where I'm going to look. Paragraph 3, this is where we get to find out that MHK herself believes that she is a talk story-er. I didn't really know talk story writer, talk story artist. All the combinations seemed a little bit awkward, so I came up with an even more awkward one, talk story-er, but I'm just going to stick with that. And not only does MHK fancy herself a talk story-er, but her book Chinaman also demonstrates that she is in fact a creator of talk story works. So having done that analysis and the reading, I'm just going to push right into the first question, number 14 here, which is a main point question, as they usually are. Yeah, I'm going to dive right into answers here. Not really going to bother predicting what I would consider a main point to be based on my own analysis. I am simply going to take what they offer me, the choices, and judge that against what I would know about the passage's main point. So starting here with A, this actually sounds pretty good. I am going to check the others, but it does sound okay. So despite some critics' comments, Kingston's writings have significant Chinese-American antecedents which can be found in the traditional or narrative form known as talk stories. So this has all the elements that I'm really looking for. Despite critics getting it wrong, we do have that element. MHK's writing have a significant antecedent, which is kind of the whole initial first sentence point about those critics being wrong was an ex nihilo judgment. And really, that's not true because we know that there is precedent for Kingston's work. It comes from somewhere, and that somewhere happens to be talk story. That kind of has everything that I'm looking for. Moving along to B, this seems quite inferior. It feels too narrow. It trades mostly on the whole frozen concept from the end of paragraph 3, but it doesn't really have all the elements that I was looking for, like A does. C has the opposite problem that B does. This one feels too broad. The passage ultimately was a discussion about MHK, like C says, but C also makes it sound like it was really about the wider failures of literary criticism. And so I don't really think that that's a fair characterization of what was going on here. D is also pretty problematic. It does feel too narrow. I dislike how it leaves out the whole we need to rethink how we interpret MHK's work angle out of it. And so they're just really... D makes it sound like it's just like a very factual, expository only discussion of what it is technically that MHK was up to, not the whole call for a reinterpretation of oral versus written traditions and whatnot. E, I don't really know if I would call it too narrow or broad, but it just feels irrelevant. Nothing I read indicated that this sort of rekindling of interest in talk story existed anywhere. And also, further problematically, rekindling? Was anyone ever talking about talk story in the first place? There was no indication of that as far as I could tell. I mean, I'm not going to go reread anything yet because I don't have to. But just from my 4 analyses of the paragraphs, I just don't really see any room for that to have been brought up. So I'm going to select A because it's the only one that doesn't actually do anything wrong, on top of having all the things that I consider right at the same time. Pushing on to number 15, which is an inference question. It's kind of open-ended, so there's really not much that we can do, and not much that I would want to do anyway. So really I'm going to put Principle 5 to work testing the answer choices. Specifically, I will be assessing answer choices based on whether or not I think there's room for discussion within the passage's structure and other logical formats and bases not really anything purely factual. And notably, I actually do not care whether I remember the details invoked by the answer choice or not. In fact, that's never really relevant for me because I skip so much of every passage. But of course, I will end up rereading some of it here or going back and reading the stuff that I had skipped for the first time, really. So I will be addressing the text much more closely moving forward, but initially, that's not really going to be my concern. So answer choices, starting with A. I seriously doubt A based on the structure of the passage. Is it true that in the last few years, written forms of talk story have appeared in Chinese as often as they have in English? I'm not even sure why I would look this up. This is kind of irrelevant. I really don't see where I would find this in the passage. Answer choice B. I also seriously doubt this based on the structure. It's not quite as bad as A though. If anywhere, I'll probably find information about this in paragraph 2, maybe in paragraph 3. I have the same problem with B though ultimately that I do with A, which is that these both seem to talk about scholars having a broad discussion about what talk story is, but I kind of got the sense that everything about talk story that our author brings up is stuff that the Western literary written critical establishment wasn't really that familiar with, and that's why they missed that aspect of MHK's work in the first place. So this seems kind of dumb, both A and B, that so many people would be so concerned with discussing talk story when the whole point of the passage seems to be founded on the fact that not enough people actually even understand that it exists. Alright, C is finally the first one that I think could possibly be right. This is possible based on the structures, likely in paragraph 2. Talk story is developed in the U.S. through a process of combining Chinese and other words. So, paragraph 2, I recall, is about what talk story actually is, and one of the things that my eyes passed over as I was making it to the last sentence, between the first and the last sentence, was something about talk story kind of coming over to the U.S. along with the people who were emigrating as a sort of completed art form. So if I found anything about this, it would probably be in paragraph 2. D also I consider a possibility. It's possible based on the structure. It could be in paragraphs 2, 3, or 4. If I had to guess, Chinese American talk story relies upon memory processes. This may be a paragraph 4 or 3 thing. 2 is just a maybe. It's only because there's a whole Chinese American discussion there that I think too. But I'm thinking we're going to find it in paragraph 3 or 4, this information here. And finally, getting to E here, I also seriously doubt E based on the structure of the passage. We're told very early on, again, that critics are ignorant of the whole talk stories thing. So it seems unlikely that there would be room, amid all the other discussion that we've been having, of those same critics somehow being opposed to the author's characterization of MHK's work. So again, this is kind of like the problems that I had with A and B, is where this whole passage was kind of premised on the idea that not enough literary scholars even knew talk story was, in a literary tradition to which they should have applied MHK's work. And so to think, for then A, B, and E to then say that, scholars are actually having a pretty robust discussion about talk story, and are on top of that having enough room in this passage to disagree with the author's treatment of MHK, vis-a-vis talk story, that seems like very, very wishful thinking. Just doesn't fit. So at this point, because I didn't like A, B, and E for very much the same reasons, C and D are my only contenders, and I do have to research them. If both of them turn out poorly, I will need to reconsider the others, which is always discomforting, but hopefully one of these two will prove acceptable to us. So starting with C, my assessment of this one was that it was possible, there's a possibility of it, and if it is possible, it was going to be in paragraph 2 that I would find support for it. So let's look there. And now that I'm looking at paragraph 2, I do not see any talk of talk story developing in the U.S. Talk story was already a fully fledged art form, as I kind of half remember, but now I've been able to confirm by rereading. It was already a fully fledged art form, capable of producing masterpieces when it got here. So there really wasn't a development here, stateside, that I see discussed. This discussion of how talk story may have developed in the U.S. is also notably absent from paragraphs 3 and 4, so overall things are not looking good for C. I'm not going to fully eliminate it again because I'm just paranoid that this being the second question and me having skipped so much, I may have to reconsider all my eliminations in case D doesn't pan out here, but yeah, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good for C. So previously, my assessment of D was that it was also possible, based on the structure of the passage, I could see where the passage had room for this idea. Initially, I thought it would be in paragraphs 2, 3, or 4. Having just reread paragraph 2 for answer choice C, I don't really see any information about D in there. So I'm just going to restrict myself to looking at paragraphs 3 and 4 to see if I find a justification for the idea that, talk story relies on memory processes that don't emphasize the retention of precise sequences of words. Seems highly specific. And as I'm perusing paragraph 3, I do see it right there. And specifically, I'm looking at the part where it says that MHK distinguishes her work as thematic. And we don't actually need to know precisely what thematic means, and this is, thematic here would not be a 3.1 issue of like just a fancy word, but 3.2, because I think the word thematic technically describes something very core about her work here. So, but even though it's a technical term, I don't really need to worry about the sort of wishy-washy, odd, hard to work with definition that they provide us, because it's placed in opposition to print-oriented culture that emphasizes the retention of precise sequences of words. So this is pretty much exactly what we were looking for. We hear that MHK wants to distinguish and separate her work from print-oriented work, and the thing that we hear about print-oriented work here is that it does in fact emphasize retention of specific sequences of words, and so if MHK is separating her work from that pile, presumably her work doesn't have that same dependence. And because that opposition sets up the implication that MHK's thematic talk story doesn't have that same reliance on those specific word sequences, I'm going to select D. Pushing on to 16, this is also an inference, but it's specifically about something. So it's an inference regarding the whole personally remembered stories bit. And so we just came across this in our research for question 15, where we saw that that description was placed in opposition to the print-oriented culture's reliance on precise sequences of words. So if anything, we're just already going to default to a guess where personally remembered stories are going to operate differently than precise sequences of words. So armed with this knowledge, I'm just going to go into answer choice A here. I seriously doubt this one based on structure. Any first-person aspect of this whole thing didn't seem as important as its opposition to the whole word sequence requirement. B, I also have serious reservations about based on the structure. Any personal aspect of the whole personally remembered stories didn't seem as important as its opposition to word sequence. So same problem that A has, just with a slightly different twist, but fundamentally it doesn't really trade on the opposition to word sequence that I'm looking for. C is a maybe. Compared to A and B, it does finally invoke idiosyncrasy, meaning that it's not like the rigid word sequence thing. It's not the way I would personally choose to characterize what the passage says, but it at least comes closer, I think, than A and B. So that's a maybe, but I really do have to check the others here. No, D, absolutely not. Absolutely not. In making it so, the retention of memory of precise sequences of words, this is the exact opposite of what we're supposed to go for. Easiest elimination so far. Answer choice E is not quite as openly terrible as D, but it's still pretty awful. Thematic was the word MHK used to describe her talk story style, not themes in wider literature as E is kind of suggesting. So, again, thematic was a specific term, that MHK used to describe her own stuff. It wasn't part of a broader discussion. And so as weird as it is, C is the only one that even remotely addresses the idea that talk story does not rely on precise sequences of words, and that something about it is, not quite standard, it doesn't really always fit the same set of words, that whole thing. As unconvinced as I was, it's really the only one that comes close or has any chance of being right, so I would select C at this point. I do want to note here that this would have been very difficult if you didn't know what the word idiosyncratic means. Unfortunately, the Principle 3.1, 3.2 context shortcuts that I talked about, they really only apply to words from the passage and not the answer choices. The answer choices often don't have the room to explain what special words mean. So if English isn't your first language, you just didn't come across this in your studies, you don't know how to use it, you don't know what it is, sorry, I don't really have anything else to say other than, it's hard. It's hard to try to expect to go to a professional school in a country that doesn't speak your first language. So yeah, not much I can do here. I'm not really into the language teaching aspect of it. Now, for those of you who are native speakers but also did not know what idiosyncratic meant, I don't know. I also don't know what to say other than sorry. I don't know if it's your fault or if it's your high school's fault, but somewhere at that stage of your education, they should have exposed you to that word, but they didn't. So yeah, sorry about that. Now, 17 is an analogy question, and while I personally feel pretty good about these, I know that this is a common pain point for a lot of you. So let's go over this with a fair amount of care. So the analogy, which is a little odd, they're saying that MHK's use of English is most like which one of the following uses of cotton fibers slash cloth. So cotton and English, I guess. So we do have another crossroads situation here. Our first option is we could try to characterize MHK's use of English to maybe predict what kind of answer we're looking for. Or option 2 is that we could just go answer by answer. Both choices, I would say, are both fine, viable, and equally valid, but they are better for different testers, I think. I would say pick choice 1 if you've historically been good at predicting an analogy answer language. And this leverages principle 1, 3.2, and 4. And so if reading passages and researching passages because you had a pretty solid idea of where to look has come easily to you and you've been pretty good at predicting analogy language so far, feel free to just kind of make up your own prediction and go for it from there. Pick option 2 if you've historically been worse at predicting these analogy questions. And here, the idea would be that you would let the answer choices do all the guesswork for you. And really all you would do is judge each choice based on what you know of the passage. And so you don't have to be predictive about it, you kind of just let them give you these things, and all you need to do is make sure that you are judging them consistently. And it's kind of ironically or just oddly, despite my unpreference for predictive work, when it comes to analogies, I do prefer choice 1. I do like to predict ahead of time. And I think that's just because I like analogies and it just kind of comes easier to me that way. But my point is, even though I personally prefer choice 1 as a practical matter, choice 2 really isn't actually all that different. And what I want to highlight about choice 2 is that if you do choice 2 correctly, it's a lot like letting answer choices make deductions for you on LG, which is something that I've demonstrated in the LG flexibility lesson that I just put up. But also it's something that you'll see when you're kind of brute forcing things, is where questions and their answer choices in LG will reveal to you deductions just by the very nature of the way they're set up. And so you don't have to do the guesswork part of knowing where to look for deductions. The answer choices will just kind of put them in front of you. And that's kind of what choice 2 does here if you either feel your handle on the passage is weak or if your handle on RC overall is weak for analogy questions. You could just take path 2 and it will bring you home. And so with all that said, for the purposes of teaching you guys how flexibility looks like and how to practice it, I will be going with option number 2 today. So going back, I just want to make sure that I have the analogy straight. MHK's use of English is most like which one of the following uses of cotton fiber slash cloth. Paragraph 4, I think, is the only place I feel the passage discusses MHK's use of English. We know how she sees herself in her work in paragraph 3. Paragraph 2 had nothing about her using English, so I really think paragraph 4 is the place, but in case I missed it by some horrible bad luck, I guess I can check paragraph 2 and 3 if I don't find it in the 4, but I'm pretty sure that's where it is. So I'm just going to go through answer choice by answer choice and compare it against what I find in paragraph 4 and see where to go from there. So starting with A, I actually ended up eliminating this one. And this is another vocabulary issue that some of you foreign students might, or overseas students I should say, might struggle with. If you don't know what a quilt is, you can infer from answer choice A that whatever it is something that is constructed from many smaller scraps. And I would say this is a rare case where principle 3.1 works for answer choices. Because remember I said that whole context thing from 3.1 applies mostly or pretty much only to strange words in the passage. Sometimes there are strange words in an answer choice that the answer choice nevertheless still has the room to explain for you. So yeah, I feel like A does that for us. And now that we understand what A is saying, how does it stack up against what I see in paragraph 4? Well, paragraph 4 says that MHK invests English with some kind of Chinese texture. It does not sound like MHK is taking small fragments of English and Chinese and sewing them together into some larger Frankenstein whole. It doesn't sound like this sort of quilt description that they offered in the first part of answer choice A. So I don't really like it. It doesn't. Yeah, it just invests whatever that means. Even though I don't know what that means, it sure doesn't sound like takes small, basically broken pieces and just kind of puts them all together into a larger whole. Doesn't sound like that's what she's doing. B was also elimination for me. I stopped reading this one at the word simulated because I didn't think MHK was trying to simulate talk story. The passage very clearly tells us in a couple of different ways that MHK's work is talk story. And because of that, I just stopped reading there and eliminated. I also eliminated C. There was really no question of whether English or Chinese was more or less appropriate for any usage in paragraph 4. I just checked paragraph 2 and 3 real quick. I didn't see any comparison of that either in terms of their value or appropriateness. I eliminated D very quickly as well. MHK didn't use English because it was roughly the same as Chinese. If paragraph 4 is to be believed, Chinese is very different, and kind of her ability to make English kind of do Chinese things is what was special about her work, maybe. And finally, we got to E, and also, discomfortingly, I found a reason to eliminate this one as well. It sounded good until we got to that weird savings bit at the end. That mindset of savings had nothing to do with MHK, I don't think there was any artistic efficiency or literal money savings involved anywhere. It was just dumb. Savings had nothing to do with anything, so I would eliminate E as well. So having eliminated all 5, obviously I missed something about one of the choices somewhere. So I'm going to have to reevaluate, but I'm going to try to be a little bit smarter about it instead of just running through the whole list, which I could do if I was short on time and short on insight, but here there is a very particular place I'm going to focus first. So as I was alluding to just now, in a lot of situations when I eliminate all 5, because I like and I feel pretty good about all the eliminations, my only choice is just basically to go back through all 5 answer choices and see where I can kind of backtrack. But here, the only weakness of my procedure overall was failing to read B all the way through because of my dislike of the single word simulated. So despite my elimination of B based on an incomplete reading in just one single word, Principle 5 does tell me something in the opposite. So Principle 5, of course, encourages me to judge answers on logic and structure rather than facts and content. And based on what I'm seeing here of my process, it's possible that I wasn't giving B a fair shake on the structure and logic, really due to my fixation on a single fact. The fact that MHK's work is actually talk story, not a mere simulation of it. It's possible that because that made me not read the answer completely, I may have missed something there. So instead of just going through all 5 starting with A, I'm actually going to start my reevaluation at B because I like all the eliminations I made as a general rule, but this is probably the only place I could have done better or that I potentially messed up. So I'm getting the feeling actually, hint that it actually is B already, just based on my knowledge of how sure I was of eliminating the rest, but and the fact that this is the only place where there's still any room for a changed interpretation for me. But we'll actually go through it and see. So answer choice B tells us the analogy that they're making is the surface texture of woolen cloth is simulated in a piece of cotton by a special process of weaving. So this is weird, but let's unpack it. And so the weaving part at the end, I actually like it. I skipped it initially, of course, but now that I read it, I like it. The whole invests word and everything else sounds a lot like meshing somehow English and Chinese together into one sort of porridge or soupy mix where things get kind of indistinguishable. They sort of are become one. So now that I like the weaving part, what remains for me to do is to make peace with the whole simulation bit. So again, unpacking the simulation, let's see if that actually does give me a problem that merits eliminating this one. So the question itself sets up an analogy between cotton and English. That's how we're supposed to interpret these things. Now, as for the answer choice, it says that cotton, which of course is supposed to stand for English, is being used in a special way. And from the passage, that would be English is being invested with the elusive texture of oral, that whole mess that I kind of skipped, but I understood that was the author saying that MHK had managed to take all these special Chinese things and put them into English. So yeah, English is being used in a special way to simulate linen. I guess that would be Chinese, because all those special things were really Chinese aspects of language that MHK managed to sort of implant into the English that she was using in her talk story written works. So now at this point I am seeing where I was being too harsh initially. Again, I didn't like B initially because I thought MHK's work was straight up talk story, not a mere simulation of it in English. That's what got me hung up. However, the analogy in B actually says that MHK found ways to make English do a lot of interesting things that Chinese does, which is, again, another way of saying that she got English to simulate Chinese when it comes to talk story. So my view of answer choice B was that it was wrong initially because I thought they were saying that MHK's work only simulates talk story, whereas I believe that MHK actually wrote real talk story, and so that's why I didn't like simulated. But upon closer inspection, the simulation is not between MHK's work and talk story. The simulation is between English and Chinese, and that is acceptable to me. And so as a result, I think we can select B here. And so, as for 18 through 21, I leave you the joy of doing the rest of this passage's questions on your own. You're welcome for this unwelcome gift. All I would like to offer is to let me know if this lesson or any of my other RC lessons failed to help you on questions 18 through 21. And I guess the same goes for questions 14 through 17 as well. If you don't really see eye to eye with me on those, feel free to let me know. And it doesn't have to be like a confrontational challenge thing, but like, hey, I tried this stuff. I don't really get what you're saying, or it just doesn't seem to work. What are your thoughts? And I will definitely look into it for you. So now to recap sort of the lesson and the principles here. In my experience, the single largest score killer on RC is the widespread insistence that you guys have, that you slow down and actually fully understand a passage. That is why the score curve looks the way it does. That's why people are not minus zeroing this thing. That's just no two ways about it. And the reason for that is that for the vast majority of you, that's just a waste of time. You are going to reread anyways for questions. There's almost no point in fully understanding content the first time around. And even if you didn't understand it on your first read through, the second and third pass generally doesn't change things. It's only until you have the context of answer choice and questions that are being asked that some things that you didn't understand becomes more understandable. And again, I'm not calling you guys dumb. I mean, if you spend long enough, you will get a passage, and you won't need the questions to guide you. Just reading the passage will get you the knowledge that you need. But it's all a cost-benefit thing. The amount of time it takes for most of you is just not going to be worth it. So my recommendation, of course, is to read for structure instead. It's less important to know exactly what concept X that the author talks about is, but it is much more important to know why the author wanted to talk about X in the first place. And that's something that, again, you can get without knowing what X is. I would very, very much like all of you guys to practice that at some point and come to that realization, because that is the big time saver. If there's something that you don't get, and there will be something that you don't get, these are very obscure, arcane passages about, small, forgotten corners of academic literature. There's going to be stuff that you don't get, and that's not only important for the LSAT, but it's also kind of something that happens as a practicing lawyer. You will be faced with people who are experts in their field, yet you're going to be kind of fighting them in a sense. I mean, you don't really fight your witnesses. Sometimes you do, but basically you'll be up against those kinds of people, and you will need to manage and manipulate things that aren't your wheelhouse, and that's an important thing for any litigator, but also I would say for anybody who works with any sort of specialized clients. This is important stuff. You have to be able to learn how to do this. And to kind of guide you along the way, principles 1 through 4 are all about facilitating that sort of proper structural reading. So again, I cannot say it enough. You can understand why somebody says X, even if you don't understand what X is. I mean, guys, you gotta see it. You gotta see it, and you have to try it. I'm not saying that once you have tried it, that's like the only way you're ever gonna do things. Like I said, everybody's different. Do what works for you. But this is so universally beneficial for everybody that I've kind of given it to. I cannot emphasize it enough. Even if you end up kind of going back to the way you used to read, you think. No matter what, once you kind of come to the realization that you can understand why somebody says X, even if you don't know what X is, that will still make your more standard readings that much more efficient. So guys, just practice it, do it, and if it's not working, talk to me. I would love to kind of walk you through stuff and give you that knowledge. But of course, as you know, reading is only half the battle. The rest is about how you manage answer choices. So for the answer choice half the battle, my RC principles 4 and 5, mostly 5, can help guide you there. So if you end up practicing principle 4, that whole predictive reading where you are trying to stay alert to the patterns and sort of norms of RC and academic writing, and just getting more familiar with where things are going, you'll find your ability to predict passages' movements. That will leak into your ability to sniff out the proper answer choice language as well. I think those two things just run together. I wish I had a more scientific way of describing it, but I just feel like there's just a little bit of overlap that naturally happens. But principle 5 is the real deal. Making sure your judgments are not purely about getting hung up on a specific fact or piece of content. That is what saves the day a lot of the time. And as you saw, that was something that I'm still, despite me being in the position of an instructor and not really having too many things that I don't do well on this exam, that was still something that really got me on question 17. I just eliminated an answer choice that was reasonable without even reading it because it had a particular word that I didn't like, and that one detail, which turned out to be something of a misinterpretation on my part, that one detail is what drove me to eliminate the correct answer. That happens. It happens. And so, fortunately, I was consistent enough that I managed to eliminate everything, and so it became apparent that I had eliminated the right answer. But yeah, all the same, it was a non-ideal situation, but the principle was there to guide me back to the right path. And that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe, do all the engagement stuff to help the channel, leave a comment, but most importantly, email me. Talk to me about what works, what didn't, any questions you might have. Not only will that help you, it helps the channel. If the feedback is consistent and good enough, it often results, as you've seen in the history of my channel, a new video addressing something that may have been inferiorly addressed previously. So yeah, talk to me. You know how to do that.